Hello, folks. Welcome to the Style Guides Deep Dive webinar put on by Stoplight. I'm Anna Doherty. I'm the Product Marketing Manager at Stoplight, and I am joined by my intrepid co-host, Naman. Want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hey, I'm Naman. I'm the Product Manager here at Stoplight, and I've been primarily looking at the Style Guides project. So here today to give you a deep dive into it.
Great. And he's really the star of the show, but I'm going to give you a few introductory slides, and then we'll get right into the meat of this. But just to start off with some context, I think that might be helpful for y'all. What are style guides for? Why do they matter? So to step back to the bigger question, what are we trying to get at with them? We know from research from across the industry that the number one goal of API governance for almost everyone is consistency. And why do we do that, right? Well, as your program gets big, right, as it gets bigger, things become increasingly more inconsistent, difficult to manage, difficult to predict, and all of those things impact the people who matter, and that's the people who are using your APIs. Those things all impact your developer experience. So if you have inconsistent APIs, it doesn't matter if you have internal users or external users. If they can't rely on your APIs to be easy to use and predictable, then they're going to go somewhere else. So, or they're going to complain if they're internal users, and nobody likes dissatisfaction at your workplace. So we've kind of answered this question by a few key features within both Stoplight platform and our open source tooling. So we just wanted to help you sort of think about this idea of consistency from a practical approach. Here's some tips we believe are the way to enforce consistency. What do they do? So you want to create a set of rules that you can enforce that you can apply across all of your APIs. Why do you do this? Just to cut down on the time it takes to review your API designs. That's a no-brainer. If you're cutting down on review time, that means you're getting to market faster with a better and higher quality product. And it's a better experience for your people creating your APIs as well. You promote best practices. If you have a key set of standardized rules, that means your organization has a best practices point of view, and everyone can come together and agree on those things. You can increase reliability, like I said, of your APIs, makes people want to use them. Increase security. If you have standardized rules that everyone can follow, your APIs will be more secure. You improve developer experience. Like I said, that's what we're all trying to get at. Why do you need consistency? Because at the end of the day, the people who are using your APIs need consistency. And then it will improve the quality of your program across all of your APIs. So not just one API, but every one that you have in your entire organization. If you have consistency across them, that makes your whole program more stable, reliable, and secure. And like I said, speeding up your time to market. As we're increasingly seeing more and more APIs as products, when you have a secure, stable, reliable program, you can create those products faster, get them to market, beat your competitors. So that's why we say consistency is such a crucial component to all of these things, is because it really, really makes it easier for your entire organization to both create and use APIs. So the first thing we want to start with is a poll. We want to ask y'all, have you ever created an API style guide? And so here we go. Nope, that's not it. Here we go. Well, we'll just ask in the chat. Have you ever created an API style guide? Nope. I see nopes. Yes, nopes. We're looking 50-50 split. And a lot of no's. But have been meaning to for a while. Okay, that's interesting, because I have a feeling that we have a large swath of folks across many different job titles. And so, you might be a developer, you might be a program manager, product manager, an architect. There's a lot of different roles here. And so, it's sometimes not the mandate of a developer to create a style guide, but it definitely is within your purview as a developer to inform what the style guide should be. So we wanted to help you with some best practices that Naman can share later. Okay, so now we know style guides are pretty important for consistency across the board. What did a style guide, what does it usually look like? We've seen a lot of really good examples of style guides in the wild. Google has a really great one that's very in-depth and easy to access, but it is also very static. And that's many organizations. They have a PDF version or a static web page version of a style guide. And, you know, it's kind of just a document that exists. And we think that's a good starting point, but then how do you enforce it? How do you keep it up to date? How do you keep the versions straight? How do you make sure everybody's following the rules that you've set forth? And so we said, well, what can we do about that? How can we take that static PDF version of a style guide that many people use or create, and then turn it into actionable rules? And hence the birth of both Spectral, the open source tool that creates style guides, links against them, and now our style guides projects in Stoplight platform, which allows you to create style guides, create rules against them, and share those rules across your API program and across your organization through documentation. So it's kind of an evolution of how do you go from just a static document to actionable rules to shareable, actionable, scalable rules. Here's a little peek at what we mean when we say open source Spectral. So it was traditionally a linter, but we have taken it a little step further and created sort of a more advanced style guide rule set program with it. So you can use Spectral for free, but we also think you should consider using style guides projects in Stoplight because that is, like I said, more shareable. You can enforce your style guides across your program through all your APIs. But in any case, Naman is going to take us through a couple of different best practices that you could enable in either Spectral or platform beginning today. So we have another quick question. Have you ever used Spectral? So we asked you earlier if you've created a style guide. You may not have done that, but have you ever used Spectral? If you want to put that in the chat. We'll see. We got nopes. Yes. A lot more people have used Spectral, it looks like, than have created a style guide. And I guess that makes sense. Like we talked about in the evolution, right? A lot of people have used linters, but not a lot of people have used style guides. All right, so now we get into Naman.
Yes. Thank you, Anna, for this great overview. Maybe I can share my screen and get started now. Anna, right, sweet. Perfect. So what I want to do today is, like Anna mentioned, there's been an evolution on what style guides can do. We started from a PDF, we went to Spectral, where you can create your rules. And now within Stoplight, you can create those rules and then share them across your workspace and have your projects follow them. So what I wanted to do today was get into some specific examples of what kind of rules you can create. But because from what we've seen, people aren't really sure about what kind of rules to create and what exactly can you do with these style guides. So just a quick overview of the kind of things a style guide can have. It can have naming conventions. So what do you want your parameters to look like? Do you want them to be camel case or Pascal case? Do you want your resources to be plural or not? Then there's versioning. Do you want to do URI-based versioning or path-based versioning? What kind of security schemes do you use? Error handling, how do you handle those errors? We've probably seen across different APIs that there's so much inconsistency in how people do error handling, and that's one of the reasons for a bad developer experience. So you could really put these things into style guides. Then for this open API file that you're creating, you're also using that potentially in your gateway and using it to generate code. So you need to put specific things within an open API file, and you can practically enforce that using a style guide. And then you might be using some industry organization specific standards, like you might be using JSON API, or say if you're in the health industry, you might be using FHIR. So you can create specific rules to make sure those standards are being followed in your API designs. So now what I want to do is I want to get into the examples themselves. What I'll do is go through each theme of the kind of rules you can create. Go through a few examples of how you can create those rules and just list out the rest as to these are the kind of rules you can potentially create within a style guide. The first one and an important one in your APIs are API URLs. How do URLs look like? What kind of parameters do you have? How are they structured? Having consistency in those API URLs is important. They're they're fundamentally part of especially creating REST APIs and accessing them. So I wanted to start with a basic one. Hosts must always be lowercase. Like you might know, domain names are case insensitive, but pretty much should always be written in lowercase, just because that's what the general practice is, and it makes it less confusing. So I wanted to give you a quick overview on how you can do that within within Spectral or style guides. The first thing here that you see is severity. There are 4 kinds of rules that you can create: errors, warnings, info, and hint. Errors and warnings are primarily things you want people to use, so a must or a should kind of a situation, while info and hint is just so that you can nudge people in the right practices or give them the right message in the right context. Maybe you're trying to promote some best practice for authentication that is not really a rule and just more information. So in this case, considering this is something that everybody should be following, it's an error. You give it a name, anything that you want. Then there's a message. So this is the message that people would get if they're not following it. So if I add a URL that's not lowercase, this is the message that I would get back from when I'm running the style guide. And then you can add a description, which is primarily for documentation purposes. A description in a best practice for adding a description would be to add just a general overview of what the rule is, and then potentially an example of the correct way of doing it and the incorrect way, so that a developer who's trying to fix this can easily try and fix this error in their OpenAPI specification. And the next bit is the important one, which is really the semantics of the rule itself. And for the following ones, I'm going to be pretty much focusing on these 2. So what we're doing here is we're primarily targeting the servers in the OpenAPI and the URL specifically. So that's the target. What exactly are you looking to target in this rule? And then we're using the pattern function here. And all it says is that it shouldn't contain any uppercase letters. Once you put this rule into your style guide, people won't be able to add they would get an error if they add anything but lowercase URLs. This is the first one, a simple one that I wanted to cover, but you can really go do some powerful things with Spectral or style guides themselves. So an example would be what kind of what structure do you want your URL to be? Now, some companies go for API at their end. Some might have another subdomain that they have for APIs, or it might be another domain itself that they use for APIs. So we have example here of Stripe using or Twilio using one particular convention, and Slack or Salesforce using another one. The idea is that even though there's many ways of doing these things, what we really want to be focusing on is being consistent across our organization. So whatever you choose to do, it might be putting it on a separate subdomain. It should just be consistent across the organization, so that people or developers who are consuming APIs are sure and don't really have to guess. In this case, what we're doing is again targeting the URL and using the pattern function again, but this time we're telling that the URL should end with API. So we're really enforcing the second one here. You could use the same pattern function and implement another regex to do any one of these other ways of doing URL structures. So this is another one. Casing is a big one. Again, there are different ways of doing this, path parameters. Some companies do it, use the underscore case convention. Others might use camel case. And we've done a bit of a survey of who does what here, but underscore case, by the looks of it, is the most popular one. Either way, what we're looking to do here is enforcing path parameters to be camel case in this particular example. And this one's an easy one, just casing that we're trying to enforce. So we use the casing function, target the path parameter names, and make sure they have the camel casing set. We can choose to allow digits or not. So that depends on how you want to go about parameters. In this case, we're saying it should just have letters and not digits also. So these are some of the examples I really want to dig deep into to just give you all an idea on how to create these rules. But there's a lot more that you can do with style guides. Like for hosts, trailing slashes have been a problem for a lot of developers because a trailing slash is considered a separate endpoint. So products and a trailing slash would be a separate endpoint itself. So what you want is just to be following one way. Either you always have a trailing slash or not. Mostly, you would want to not have a trailing slash if you're just starting off, but if you're already following a convention, just make sure to codify it. It's an easy one, but developers tend to miss it. And if you put it in your style guide, you'd have consistency for this. Now for paths, what you can do is have them kebab case. That's a common convention. Not adding file extensions, even though legacy APIs do have it, but it's not really something that is looked with a lot of love in the industry, so you shouldn't do that. Adding HTTP methods to your paths, like get users, is not probably a good path to add. You already have the HTTP method to tell you if it's a get or a put. So just have your resources to be nouns and have them plural. Don't add special characters to it, but not really adding HTTP methods. So these are the kind of things you can really codify again into your style guide to make sure that you're being consistent about these things. You could also, like we covered one for path parameters, do the same for query parameters. If you want them, and generally query parameters and path parameters have the same casing, but you can have them differently too, but make sure to add a rule for it. In OpenAPI, there's a separate way of defining these query parameters, so you shouldn't add them into the URI itself. Add the URI as into OpenAPI and just specify them separately. So have a rule for it. It's more of an OpenAPI best practice, but it really helps. Same goes for path parameters, should not be defined on the operation level. So these are some of the things that we've seen with our customers, what they're doing with URLs, and some of the best practices that we have seen out in the industry that you can really codify using your style guides. The next that I wanted to get into was versioning. Again, it's a topic that everybody has different opinions on, and depends on the kind of use case that you're doing. You might want API level versioning or path level versioning. Again, doing versioning in retrospect is not easy. And if it's inconsistent across your APIs, your developers consuming it would struggle too. So what you can really do is codify what versioning strategy you're using into your style guide. Now, some might want to put it into the URL itself. Some might add it to the path. Others have headers or queries that tell you which API version this is. Either way, creating a rule should be a one-time effort that should really make your lives easier across your API program, both for people designing and consuming the APIs. The example that I have here is for adding the version into the URL itself. So targeting the URL, creating a regex that says you should have the version number in the URL itself. It should either have v1 to 9. And what we're saying here is it should just have major versions and not minor versions. Again, a good practice that you can really enforce within your style guide. So this is the versioning piece. Again, different ways to do it, but you can codify all of them. If you want a header, you can enforce that the version header should always be present in an operation, or a query parameter for version should always be available. It's a similar way of enforcing these, but just make sure you have a rule for versioning themselves. Now getting into the big one, and there's a lot that we can do with security and the style guidelines that you can create with it. The first one, an easy one, but people might miss it, and that's not a good one to miss, is you should always use HTTPS. The rule that we have here is that always use HTTPS unless you are in a local environment. So the regex here, like the rule says, unless it's localhost, have HTTPS. And people would get this error if they put in anything except HTTPS. Always use this. I don't think this should be a choice. This should always be enforced. The next one, and this is where you have multiple options. You might be using API keys or OAuth, or in some case, HTTP basic too. But either way, it's a good idea to make sure you have consistent authentication schemes across your API program. In this rule, what we're trying to do is enforce OAuth 2 as the one that we use. So we're targeting the security schemes object in the Open API. We're looking to test the type, which is either OAuth 2, HTTP, or other different options. And the enumeration function is basically a set of values that you're only allowed, much like what an enum would do. In this case, we're saying the only one that's allowed is OAuth 2. If you're using a couple, you could add both. You could add both values, so it could be OAuth 2 or API key. But in this case, we're just saying that it should be OAuth 2 itself. Some other security best practices that you can enforce. Always have an API security scheme, right? So define an API security scheme. You could have a rule for that so that everybody adds a security scheme in the Open API file. And then you could either set it on a global level or an operation level. Either way, at least one of them should be done. So have a rule for that so that you don't have any endpoints lying out there which don't have a security defined. You could choose to not enforce it on a get operation if that is what how you go about your APIs. But for post, port, patch, delete, you should always have a security. Codify this rule and you'd at least be putting out endpoints that are secured. Always have a 401 defined. So 401 errors are always in there in your APIs, and people don't expect otherwise. There's some security schemes that are not really a good idea to use. So use the known security schemes. We have a list of Open API security schemes that you can use. Put a list out there so that people know that these are the only ones that you can use, much like what we did for OAuth. You can also put like a specific rule in there for HTTP basic, bearer token, or OAuth 1. Some of these authentication schemes that are deprecated or not really commonly used anymore. So anytime a developer or a designer puts an HTTP basic as a scheme that they want to use, they get an error or a message saying it's not really a great idea to use these. Same goes for API key and header, cookie, or query. They're out there, any attackers can get to it, so probably not a good idea to put them in there, and you can create a rule for that. And these are the next one is also an interesting one. One of the biggest reason for insecure APIs is putting these open-ended parameters into your API. Like you have an array that doesn't really have a size defined, or numbers that don't have a minimum or a maximum defined for them. So limit your array size, limit your numbers. Strings, you can have injection in there. So make sure you have a limit to the size of the string, like say you just want 255 characters or something, and a pattern. Maybe it's a specific kind of a parameter. So putting in a pattern or a type like date time, so that you're not accepting other kinds of things, like somebody putting in code into your string itself. Additional properties, even though are allowed in Open API, they just leave everything very open-ended. So not using additional properties is probably the best idea, and I've seen a lot of people just not allowing additional properties in their API designs. Or if you're using additional properties, at least constrain them to the amount of properties that you can add, so that at least there's some sort of a check on them. So these are some general best practices that I covered, but let's say you're using OAuth. You can also have some specific OAuth practices that you can add, like always using HTTPS on your OAuth endpoints. So we talked about enforcing HTTPS on your server URL, but also for your OAuth endpoints. Implicit and password grants are generally considered to be insecure. So maybe putting in a message where you are in error, where if somebody tries to use one of these grants, they at least get a warning. And if there's a special case, you could go through the reviews and say, all right, this is the reason why I'm using implicit or password grants. Always have scopes defined. Again, something you can enforce using a style guide. Rate limiting, this might also be part of another set of rules that you can create, but it's also a good part of security where rate limiting really saves you from denial of service attacks and other things. So always include a rate limiting header so that you can at least put those basic checks in. All right, so this was security. The next thing that we can, the next theme that we can really start to improve on using style guides is documentation. One of the primary reasons people use OpenAPI for is putting out good documentation for their consuming developers. So what can we do for documentation? We can examples. I've seen API design reviews a lot of time include things like there's a missing example for this particular response or for this particular request. Now you can put this into your style guide itself. So what we're saying here is that all examples should at least have one example defined. So every request and response body should have at least one. You could make it two also, and you can do particular bits of it. Do you want it just for requests, or do you want it just for response based on what you're targeting itself? So it's just the target property that you need to change to do any of that. But generally, adding examples to OpenAPI is good for documentation, good for other downstream tooling that you might use, like code generators. You can enforce descriptions, at least on operation level and request body level, and other places too, potentially. And just as a workaround, designers might add like 1 or 2 words, which is generally not a good idea. So you could also say that the description should at least be this length. So let's say it needs to be at least 200 characters or something like that. You should always end with a full stop. More a nitpick kind of a rule, but general consistency across this would be nice. Starting with a capital letter again, just consistency and nitpick kind of thing. One that I've been exploring and I've seen some people do is putting grammar, spelling checks into their style guides themselves, so that it is automatically run. You'd have to use custom functions for this and finding a good service. We do have local services for Windows or Linux that do this, but generally we'll be putting out maybe better examples on how you can potentially do this. But there's certainly a potential to also add grammar and spelling checks into so your descriptions don't really have spelling mistakes. I know the tech writers would love this. All right, next, error handling. Error handling, like I mentioned in the start of it, people have, there's one of the biggest reasons for a bad developer experience is just bad error handling. You'll be getting errors in 200, maybe errors that are structured differently and not really following the same structure across the API or suite of APIs. And that is what we get to first. Defining a structure for the error response. What we're doing here is saying that for any response that is greater than 400 and below 599, so the error response range in HTTP, it should have all these values and only these values. You can also use the schema function to enforce this, but this one's a good one too, so that you at least have all these, like you have an ID, you have a code, you have detail, and this really makes sure that the error is following a particular structure. Always have the 415 response code. You can also enforce 401, 403, other kind of response codes that you're looking for. So we're saying the responses property in OpenAPI should always have 415, and we're using the truthy function to do that. The truthy function just check if that is actually defined or not. So some other rules that you can cover with errors, like always include popular error responses, like the one we covered, 415, 401, 403. 500. So the error codes that you always want to have in your API and are generally expected by developers, you should add them. We enforced an error, like what kind of an error it is. We can also enforce the type. Should it always be an array? Should it just be an object? Problem JSON, something that we get from the JSON API standard, we can enforce that. And also, I think this should just be a default for everyone, which is like you shouldn't have errors in your 200 responses. All right. So we covered some style things that you can do with them, or convention things that you can do with style guides. There's also a big piece of OpenAPI that we use it for other tooling. Like you might use it in your gateway, you might use it in a code generator to generate code server side or client side. And for most of these, there's generally vendor extensions that you have to add to ensure the setup is done right for gateways or the code generator is up to par. So for that, what we can do is enforce making sure everybody adds those extensions into their API designs. Like an example would be the extensions for gateways. Now Amazon expects Amazon API gateway integration to be in there, or you might want to add service tier information. So these are the kind of things that you can enforce. And there may be gateway specific limitations. One that we have seen with Amazon is that one-off, or I think all-off, is not supported either. So you can put in the rules, make sure that you're develop, even though it's allowed in OpenAPI, but considering you're using Amazon, you might not want to be using those in your design. So you can stop people from, or nudge people at least towards not using it. For code generation setup, like enum descriptions, like OpenAPI generator expects you to add enum descriptions for it to generate better code. And that is something you can do or enforce using a style guide. And you might have some, and we've seen that with some of our customers, is you might have organization-specific extensions that you might be using for some other tooling, which is not a gateway or a code generator, and you can always enforce those too. Again, generally, what we're doing with the style guide is instead of going through these specific things in the review, we can automate this. So we are codifying them into the style guide and making sure that everybody's really being nudged to adding them so that we have better quality specifications that can be used easily. Now you might be using some industry standards, and if you're lucky, you started with that, something like JSON API or Zalando RESTful guidelines. Most of the rules within these standards, even like open banking or IATA, if you're in some specific industry, they can be codified into some of these style guides. And I'll be covering some of those examples like JSON API and Zalando. So you can really create rules to codify those standards into your everyday linting instead of people having to read those long standards. And you can really promote these using style guides. And finally, and I think this is one of the this is the one that spectral or style guides are most commonly used for today. I think for more because of the lack of knowledge on what else you can do with style guides, which is primarily OpenAPI best practices. Like you should have tags on each endpoint, or have an OpenAPI version. Operation IDs should be defined. You should add contact and license information. Even Stoplight and Spectral come with a default style guide that follows some of these best practices. But it's generally a good idea to add these. At the end of the day, this OpenAPI is going to be used in a lot of ways. It's the contract between everybody designing and consuming this API. So putting these OpenAPI best practices into the style guide really helps increase the quality of the specs, or sorry, the documents being produced. All right, so, and this is a question that was asked, that if we're going to be covering this. Now, once you have created these rules, codified them using Stoplight's UI or using Spectral, you can also enforce these rules as part of your CI in the review process. I have two examples here. We have GitHub. As part of each PR, the style guide is being run, and it's being shown as to if those rules are passing or not. And we're doing the same in Circle CI. We'll be sharing some links as to how to do this, and I'll be covering it in the demo too a bit. But generally, the idea is that with the style guides created and given to your developers, you're getting a lot closer to producing consistent APIs. But without enforcement, things might really not get to the point where you are looking for them to get. So enforce them as part of your CI, maybe as your PR review process. Like each PR should have this check, and it must be passed before a review can be performed and before it can be merged. So this really gives a superpower to the style guide itself, which is you have rules, people are getting real-time linting within their design environment, but then they're also being enforced as part of their CI process to make sure that these rules are being followed. Anna touched on this a bit as to what the perks of the design, these style guides are. One particular one that I wanted to get into a bit of more detail is faster API design reviews. Now, generally, from what we've seen, reviews include a lot of these things, like naming conventions, security schemes, versioning strategy, the things that we were really covering in these style guide rules. Once you have the style guide and you've automated it, instead of your design review being about all the stuff that you really already have conventions for, or you should, you can focus on the why for the API. Now, a review is created, these checks are already passing, so you can be confident that you're following the conventions. What you can then focus on is, does this API really provide the business capability that we are looking for? Does it fulfill the use cases? Is the developer experience up to mark? Like things that cannot be automated. Do you require 5 endpoint calls, one after the other, just to fulfill a basic use case, or is it making it easier for people to get to do what they're really trying to do? So I think API design reviews should be happening, and I think that's something that a lot of people are doing already. But they should more be focused on the why, and these conventions should be automated using these style guides and the rules that I just went through. All right, so we covered the rule examples. We talked about the CI a bit, and I wanted to show it to you all in practice. So what I'll do now is first show you how we talked about some of those rules, and I created them, like codified some of them within Stoplight itself. So what you're seeing today, right now, is my workspace where I've created a style guide. And what does a style guide project have? It just has rules and then some targets. If you're trying to create a reusable part of OpenAPI to target, you can use a target. And then there's custom functions. I'm going to be primarily focusing on the rules bit here. So we talked about the HTTPS one, like you should always be using HTTPS, created a target for it, and then said it should only have the HTTPS value. And here we have one for kebab case and paths, and the others that we covered. There shouldn't be any HTTP words. What it does is it says that it should not match any one of these. So if somebody puts in, like, say, create user into their URL, it would give you an error. And what we have here is this is the playground for people creating these style guides and maintaining them. You can easily duplicate a rule, create them using this UI here. You don't need to look at JSON or YAML to be creating them. And then you can also test them out right here. So let's say, I'll try this one. What this rule particularly says that server should have API. You can go into the debug mode and see if your rule actually works. Once I put it in here, it goes away. This is me testing out that my rule works. And then I can publish it and for my users to start using it. There are other examples so these are some of the URL rules that we had. Then I also mentioned that I'll be covering some of these standards too. We have a style guide here, which is for JSON API. We're still working through it, but you need to have 406 response codes. It has some rules around errors and how errors should be and how objects or requests should be. So you can really codify some of these things. our goal with these standards is to create these style guides and provide them as presets. So if you're using JSON API, instead of you having to build these rules out, you can just enable them in your workspace without having to actually go through them and then tweak them around if you're doing something specific to your own organization, which might not be part of the standard. We have the AWS API Gateway one, which is specific things to the Amazon gateway, which you can really enforce so that if you're using the Amazon API Gateway, you're not doing something that is not allowed. There's some for like what kind of model names does it allow, and it should always have an open API version, and there might be some overlap with other rules that you've created. But an interesting one here is this additional model properties one. Now this is, like you can see, it's not a warning or an error, but it's actually a hint. And hints are primarily just to nudge people towards the right thing. Now there's probably a bug in Amazon where if you add additional properties and remove them later, it will remain set to the last value specified. So this rule, even though you can use additional properties, it's nudging people to tell them that if you see this weird behavior, this is the reason it might be there for. We also have the Zalando one. We're working on codifying this too. And there's also a GitHub version of this available that people have already worked on. And again, you can codify a lot of these things. So if you're using one of these guidelines, you can know, you can start using them. So once you have the style guide, it also comes with a documentation like this, which you can use to socialize your style guide across your organization, like share a link with everybody to say, this is the style guide that we've worked on. Get some feedback before you actually tell people to start using it. Now, once you're ready for people to start using it, and I have a demo project here, it's the normal Studio UI. People are designing and developing their APIs. And then you have the manage style guides option, where you can go and enable some of these style guides. So we created the URL style guides one, you can enable it. And if I go into the API now, I should see that I have two examples here, one's with and one's without errors. So against all these rules, like you should always use HTTPS and the casing or what kind of query parameters, you'll be getting errors on the right for it. Like I said that I'm using the API convention on the end of the URL. So considering I don't have it, it shows me an error, but as soon as I fix it, it should go away. Now, the idea is for designers to be getting real-time linting right in their design environment against all the rules that have been created, so that I can really follow the conventions itself without having to go somewhere else, read another style guide, and then trying to follow it. You have this style guide enabled, you created a design, fixed some of the rules, but now we come to the CI bit of it. You commit or publish this project to GitHub, and this is what you get. We add a spectral file to it, which contains all the rules, and this follows the open source spectral conventions. So even though you just created this in the UI, you enabled it in your project, each project would have the spectral file. And using this, and I'll go to the branch where I have it, you can enforce it in your CI using different a few different ways. Now, what I'm going to be showing is for GitHub itself. So we have a main.yml GitHub action here, which says that run the spectral file against these open API files, all the YAML files in the repository. And you can make it so that it doesn't let you merge it too. But what it's doing here is it's running the spectral check, and you can see the results for it within GitHub too. So as people create these pull requests, they can get these errors. And if you have that setting on, they cannot merge their PRs till at least the errors are fixed, or you can have an option where also the warnings need to be fixed before you actually can merge these PRs. And these errors are the same as you'd get in your API project. So they're seeing them here, but if they miss out on one of these, it can be enforced using the CI. And while you're doing the review, you'd only be doing the review once all of this has passed. So you've really automated this, made sure this has passed. You can see the check in the CI too, and then focus on the why of the API and really go from there. This is for GitHub, but there's this repository, and we can share the link later too, which has examples for everything. Like if you want to set it up in Bitbucket, this pipelines, this is how it looks. All you need to do is run Spectral with the Spectral, give the path to the spectral.json file, and then you can also configure as to how the results would look like. This is about the CI itself. And this is pretty much the demo that I wanted to give. There's a couple more slides that I wanted to cover before we just start wrapping this up, which is, and one, some of you might already be using Spectral, and what I was showing you today was within the Stoplight platform itself. So what's the difference? It has out-of-the-box support for Stoplight Studio, so you get real-time linting results. You don't need to update your style guide or like copy your style guide to different projects. Just create the style guide project, maintain it, and everybody can start using it. And you can do it using a UI editor. And you also get generated documentation out of it to socialize it within the organization. If people want to fix errors, they can go through the docs. So you don't have to maintain a separate documentation for the rule set manually. It just is generated from the Spectral file that you create. Finally, so what's next for style guides, or how do we envision it moving forward? Some of the near-term things that we'll be doing is the rules that I've covered today, or the ideas for the rules that we've covered today. We'll be adding them to the style guide rulebook series that we've been doing. So this comes as an entry on our blog. We wrote one on consistent URLs. We're going to be writing it on security, documentation. So you can really see the details of as to how to create these rules. The next step for these popular rules would be to create presets. So instead of having people design or create these rules, we will be adding them to the Stoplight public marketplace kind of a concept, where you can enable them and start using them, maybe tweak them around by duplicating them. But the idea would be that you can get started with these presets already. This is something that we're working on already, which is today, everybody has to go in and enable a style guide once you've created that. We want to have a default style guide or guides for the workspace itself. So the person who's responsible for these standards could go and say that this is the default style guide. All projects should have it, and if they should be able to remove it or not. The idea is to, from this concept of codifying the style guides, now moving a bit towards enforcing them. And the next step to that would be to show some analytics across the organization for the conformance of it. So how are you doing with your style guides? How's the conformance improving over time? Which projects have more errors, which have less? So you can really have a bigger picture on your on your API program maturity, and really maybe pinpoint some of those APIs that might need some more love than others. So this is some of those things that we're thinking for style guides, but if you all have more ideas as to what you would want to see here, just let us know. All right, I'll pass it on to Anna now so that she can wrap this up. And
okay, so we do have a couple questions that I'm going to ask you, Naman, that came in the chat. The first one is, how do we get access to API stylebook.stoplight.io with these references shown here? Is it available to review?
Yeah, so like I was talking about, we're working on these, and these should be available pretty soon. Just keep a check on our what's new, and this should be available pretty soon. We'll be announcing them. We'll be starting with some of those best practices like URL style guidelines so that we can provide them, and then these other standards like Zalando and JSON API. But they should be coming soon for sure.
Can we import our Spectral files to create a new style guide project in Stoplight, or do I have to manually recreate the rules in the UI?
The import feature is nearly complete and behind a feature flag that should be available within a week or so. You can import a Spectral file today in an API project, but for style guide projects, that's just something that we're finalizing, and we'll put it out there.
That question came from Travis at SPS Commerce. Maybe we can get him the feature flag so he can test it out. He's a pretty good collaborator with us. And then,
for sure,
totally agree. And And then can the rule set developed on platform be exported to spectral files for use in pipeline?
Yes, so like I covered it in my demo, once you add a style guide to a Git project and you push it to your version control, the spectral file is added as part of it. So you can use your CI to run against it, and you can use it to run against run the style guide against your project in your CI on GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever other thing that you're using.
Raphael says, I know it is off topic, but is there any plans to support Azure DevOps repositories? Actually, yes, we are working on that right now. So that's one of our teams is working on that, and we should have news for you in the next month. So keep a lookout. We'll make sure you get notified of that, Raphael. Robert asks, creating the given statement is sometimes confusing or difficult. Is there a tool to simplify creating those?
I agree with that. The given or like the especially the JSON path piece is confusing. So one thing that we've done is by default, we provide some JSON paths that are already there. So if you want to target examples or query parameters or path parameters, there's a preset that you can use instead of having to write those JSON paths. We want to keep adding to those presets for you all to use. If it's something specific that you can always go and you write as JSON path, but our goal is for 80% of the use cases or more, we should be able to cover using those presets. But also, like there's a tool out there called JSON Path Evaluator, I mean, that is like you can Google that. Is what you can do with that is put in an OpenAPI file and test a JSON path for it, which is what part of the document you're targeting. So that is something that we use to create these JSON paths too. So if you don't find something in the presets and you want to write a JSON path, that might be helpful. We want to bring something like that into the style guides too, but that probably would be into the distant future.
Michael asks, you demoed JSON API earlier. Is there a roadmap or other view when this or other public rule sets will be made available? I believe this is still going to be made available on the API rulebook sandbox, right?
It's similar to the first question. We're working on them. We'll be sharing them one by one. So keep an eye out for it. We'll be putting these out pretty soon. I don't have specific dates on when this would be out, but we're actively working on this. So you'll have presets for the rules like URL guidelines, security best practices, JSON APIs, Lando. We're looking to put all of these out. And you can use them in your workspace itself. You don't need access to API style book to use them.
I'm letting them know in chat that we will make sure those rule sets and the links are sent right to you the moment that they're available. Anyone who attended this, it's going to be, your email address we'll use to send those directly to you so you don't miss them. Paula asks, can I set rules on Studio Web UI in a single project and let my team consume it on multiple projects with Studio Desktop?
All right, so Studio Desktop doesn't have out-of-the-box style guides, so you won't get a UI like the managed style guides one. But what you can do is create a style guide within Stoplight, import that project, like import that Git project into Stoplight Web, and enable that style guide and publish it. So once they have that spectral.json file in there, it should run in Studio Desktop too. So that's a workaround that you can use, but Studio Desktop doesn't have out-of-the-box support for style guides. If you really want to use style guides with the way that we're looking to envision and use it, Studio Web would be the right way, but there's a workaround certainly for desktop too.
So we covered a lot of stuff today, and thank you, Naman, for answering those questions live. But we will send this recording, these slides, and all of the links to the resources we discussed today to you in an email. And these are all links that you'll be able to follow. We'll make sure you're able to access these, but that includes the rule sets web blogs that Naman said, each of the rules book series. We have some documentation for you. We have a lot of good stuff here. So we'll make sure this gets sent to you. And if you have additional questions, we'll be happy to answer those in email. We got one more. I would really like to design all my contracts with Studio. Any plans on adding support for gRPC and Avro?
So yeah, right now OpenAPI Stoplight just supports OpenAPI. We certainly have plans to go beyond REST. Like that's certainly a 1 year, 2 year plan for us. The next one that we at least think would be the one that we tackle would be async API and potentially gRPC and others later. For async API specifically, we do have Spectral support. So if you're really looking to create these style guides or use them, there's async Spectral support for that. So at least you can do that. But yes, hopefully in the future, Stoplight would be able to cover a lot of these like gRPC, async API, and maybe GraphQL too.
Yep, and I just put a little link in the chat. Roadmap.stoplight.io is where we have places you can vote. We do have entries for both GraphQL and async. So if you really want it, go there and vote, and it'll help raise it to the top of our roadmap. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Naman, thank you for your big brain and your expertise today and sharing it with all these folks. Like I said, we'll be sending the email with all the resources around. And if you have questions, we're always willing to talk and help you answer those. We want to help you out using these new features as well as we can. So I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your week. And thanks for joining.